welcome an ex-colleague of mine, Pat Glynn, who was in days gone by not only head of history at JFS, but I think Daniel's history teacher. So we're renewing a few old acquaintances too. Okay, Daniel, back to you. Welcome. As I said, there were details of your CV on the stuff that went out, but of course the most important aspects of your past history are that you grew up in Kenton. So just to get us on our way, I just wondered if you had any memories of growing up in Kenton you could share with us.
Oh my gosh, what a question. Thank you for the invitation, Jane and David Hampman, and hello again, Mr. Harris, nice to see you. Memories of Kenton, I mean, so many, I suppose. It was always a very, very early start on the train to JFS, I must say. I do remember being very jealous of some of the friends who lived a bit closer, getting up sort of bright and early and marching with my school bag, which was bigger than me, to Preston Road was quite an adventure. And I can actually see my friend Laura Bussey, who is here tonight, who I haven't seen in a very long time, who has done some work promoting the event, and she might be known to members of the community. So nice to see her here. Okay.
So you've mentioned that you were at Seymour School, weren't you? And
yeah.
Then you went to JFS, your secondary education. I mean, we've worked out over the email correspondence over the past few weeks who your friends were and which year we were in, and gone through all that business. And I was just wondering, I mean, did JFS play a role in inspiring you to do what you're currently doing?
I mean, I think it'd be hard to say it didn't. Sort of the Jewish education we received there, and the excellent teaching we got, I think perhaps was something I only really noticed in the years afterwards. So sort of at university, and then in the years that followed, living in France, taking French at school without having any connection whatsoever to France, and then sort of speaking to other people who I met at university and finding out what their teachers were like at high school. And then thinking, gosh, we actually, for example, we had French teachers who had actually, lived in France or even were French themselves, so I really don't think at the time I quite appreciated how lucky we were to have such wonderful language teachers. And languages is just something that still is so close to my heart. And I'm always trying to encourage more and more people to do languages at A level and then at university.
Okay, so you go through JFS. I wondered if you could just give us a quick guided tour as to what's happened to you since you left school.
So I went to France after I left school to learn a bit of French. I worked in restaurants in Paris, and I then went to Sussex to do my first degree in history and French, mainly concentrating on the French. And then I sort of kept going. The pull to France was always very, very strong for me, always wanting to go back to France, spending every holiday, winter, Easter, summer there. And then all through my university days, I was finding myself there more and more. And I just decided that I wanted to sort of get to know France more academically. And so I did my master's and then my PhD in French history, and concentrated on the history of the Jews of France, because when I was an undergraduate, I spent a year in Paris doing a history degree. And I found myself one day in a classroom with 20 other students, and I was the only foreigner. And this teacher just started talking to us about Nazi-occupied France. And I remember vividly this feeling of sort of, constantly putting up my hand and saying like, Madame, who is this Pétain? And what do you mean they collaborated? No, excuse me, what do you mean? And all the other French kids were just constantly looking at me, probably thinking, who is this idiot? Not quite understanding why I was asking these questions. But then I think as the weeks went on, I sort of realized that as a foreigner, I was able to ask questions that the other French kids dare not ask, and that they were sometimes goading me and encouraging me to ask certain questions. I think that's something that I noticed very early on, that as somebody who wasn't French, it was very easy to me to talk to elderly people about their memories of Nazi-occupied France in a way that a French person just couldn't. I had privileged access. People would tell me, oh, you know, let me tell you, you foreigner, what life was like here. But they wouldn't have done that to a French person. And some of the most wonderful, I treasure the interviewees who gave up so much of their time for me. Hundreds of hours of interviews I've got recorded, but none of those people are alive anymore, unfortunately. I was interviewing, you know, the spring chickens of the people were interviewing at the time was probably 85, 86. So most people were well into their 90s.
Okay, well, that kind of brings us nicely up to date and to this remarkable book, The SS Officer's Armchair. I think you'd better look away now, Daniel, because I'm going to tell people that this is a brilliant read. It's a great book. It's authoritative, it's accessible, it's scholarly without being stuffy or pretentious or tedious. It's a real page turner. Highly recommended. Okay, you can turn around now. So having said that, I just wondered if it's possible if you could just give everybody a summary of what the book's about, and intriguingly, of course, how it came into being.
Sure. So, I presume that not a single person has read my book, because I think everybody at the moment is reading lots and lots of wonderful stuff about sort of COVID-19 and Trump. So sort of the Second World War, the Holocaust isn't on everybody's agenda, unfortunately. So very, very quickly, this is a book. Well, I suppose I'll tell you how I came to write this book. I'd finished my PhD. I was living in Italy. I was doing research in Florence. And one day, somebody sort of came up to me at an event I was at and said, oh, you're this new historian of the Second World War. There's something extraordinary that's just happened to my mother, and I want to talk to you about it. And, you know, when you're a historian of the Second World War, it's very normal. People come up to you all the time and they want to tell you stories about their grandfathers in the resistance or aunts who were deported or whatever. But these things always happened many, many years ago. They happened 70, 80 years ago. Things don't just happen to people's mothers. And she told me how her mother had just taken this old armchair to be reupholstered in Amsterdam, where she was living. And, you know, it was falling apart at the seams. And a few days later, when she went to collect it, the man who was doing the work, the upholsterer, was really quite angry with her. I think Jane and David, we might have a picture of the chair if you might want to show it. But so he was really cross with her. And he said sort of, you know, what is this? I don't do work for Nazis or their families. Oh, here's the chair. So it's a very ordinary looking chair. So the upholsterer in Amsterdam is like, what is this? I don't do work for Nazis or their families. And he just presented her with a bundle of documents, of Nazi era documents covered in Nazi swastikas, all belonging to one man called Robert Griezinger from Stuttgart. And he's like, who is this? Is this your dad? Is it your uncle? You know, get out my shop, that kind of thing. And this woman was totally flabbergasted. She had absolutely no idea who Robert Griezinger was. She had no idea how all of these documents ended up inside her armchair, because the man was not her father. She had purchased this armchair when she was a student in the 1960s. So I think maybe we have another photo, for example, of one of the documents that was discovered inside the armchair. So here we go, for example, this was the man. She had absolutely no idea who he was. This is his passport. And I suppose it's worth mentioning that all of Griezinger's documents discovered inside the armchair were deeply personal. They're sort of not old bus tickets or receipts or anything like that. They're all his identity papers, the kinds of things you cannot live without, the things he would have kept in his breast pocket. So he, the woman had no idea who he was, how the documents got into his armchair. She had bought the chair in the 1960s. She was a student in Prague. And when she was sort of 18, 19, like all of us at the time, went around the city going into secondhand shops, and she just needed some things to furnish her student digs. So she saw this chair, she liked the chair. And in the 1980s, when some families were allowed to leave communist Czechoslovakia, she took this armchair with her on the train, and she's had it ever since in the Netherlands. And it's the kind of chair that, the kids would just sit on, and it was not like a chair for special occasions or anything like that. It was really sort of, you see it in the background of family photos. And so, as I was saying, this young woman just sort of came up to me and said, you're this historian. Who was this man, Dr. Griezinger? And how did his documents end up inside my armchair? The kind of, I did my homework on this chair every single day for my whole life. I've been sitting on his documents. Can you find out for me? So that's what I decided. That's what got me interested in him in the first place. I decided to write my book originally about this armchair. I wanted to know everything about this chair. I wanted to know how much it cost. Who was its intended buyer? Was it made in Germany? Was it made in Czechoslovakia? Had it ever belonged to a Jewish family? We know, for example, that so many items of furniture that had once belonged to Jewish families in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, later ended up being shipped east once the Jews had been deported in order to furnish the homes of Germans serving there. So I really wanted to know everything I could about the armchair itself before eventually my attention turned to the man whose documents appeared inside of them.
And this is the substance of the book, ladies and gentlemen, is this the search for Robert Griezinger, and a fantastic search it is too. Now, as I mentioned, Daniel, in our correspondence, there were just issues that arose out, perhaps issues is the wrong word, but topics and subjects and things which arose out of the book, which I just thought it might be worth exploring, and you can kind of link Greezinger in as we go along. My wife, Vivian, who was also around on this call, is a member of something called the second generation, which, for the uninitiated, is a name given to those people who are the children of Holocaust survivors. And there's a whole network of the second generation. There's a website, there's a magazine, there's meetings, there's all sorts of things. It never occurred to me, really, well, I suppose it should have done, but it never occurred to me that there's a second generation of Holocaust perpetrators.
Absolutely. That's the thing we forget as historians.
They don't have societies and magazines and websites, and they're an enormous presence in the book. So I just wondered if you could just share something with us about that, because you met these people who are one generation away from the people who, quote unquote, did it. So yeah. I just wondered if you could expand on that a bit.
Of course. I mean, it's no spoiler for me to say it here, because I say it on the first page of my book that Robert Griezinger died in 1945 in Prague. And he left behind his wife and two daughters who were young. One was 5 and one was about 8. And, I spent many, many hours with his daughters, having, after eventually tracking them down, it was really, really hard to find them because, of course, they had married, taken on their husbands' names. And so, as is always the case when tracing women in history, women sometimes do get written out. And for reasons like this, it's sometimes very, very hard to trace them. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. As when we think about the second generation, there has been a lot of ink spilled on the second generation of Holocaust, of Jews, of victims, of course, but very, very few books or indeed articles on second generation of perpetrators, because that is what he was. And even fewer still on third generation. Because like you've told us about your wife being second generation, there's of course third generation, and et cetera, it goes on. So it was a very, very curious position for me to be in, because as I said at the beginning, I spend a lot of my time interviewing people who were there, who were present during the Second World War. And the interviews are always very similar. I will appear at my interview with somebody in their 80s and 90s. I will ask all my questions, and then I will sometimes be given a cup of tea, and then I will go on my merry way. Interviewing the children of Robert Griezinger was an entirely different dynamic. I would ask all of my questions because I had tons of questions, because the whole point of Robert Griezinger, we haven't had a chance to say this yet, but Robert Griezinger is totally unknown. He's not Hitler or Heydrich or Himmler or any of these big fancy H's that we all know about. He's a total, you can't find him on the internet. He doesn't appear in any books. So the whole point of my book was to really try and see whether it was possible to write the history of somebody who has been totally, of a perpetrator who has been lost from history. And that's what I tried to do here. So I wanted to know as much as I could, biographical information and anything that his family could tell me about their father. But when I got to the end of my questions, we had this very curious role reversal in which his daughters, Jutta and Barbara, would suddenly want to ask me a ton of questions because they had grown up without a father. They had grown up in this very, very unstable environment of post-war Germany where, you know, the Second World War, the Nazism, the Holocaust, it was just totally not spoken of. Now, we say that the same happened with the victims, but that is simply, as we know now as historians, that was not the case. We know that many Jews from the late 1940s onwards tried to tell their stories, but it was a question sometimes of people not wanting to hear those stories. That was not the case with former Nazi families. There was a veil of silence that went over post-war Germany for years and years and years, okay? Nobody wanted to talk about what their fathers or mothers had done during the war. Any attempt to do so, there were these sort of strategies that people would use to avoid even answering these questions. So Griezinger's daughters grew up in this horrific environment where they could not find anything out about their own father. And eventually they just stopped. They stopped asking questions. Their mother remarried. There was no photos of their father anywhere. They knew nothing about him. So when I rocked up 70 years later, telling them this preposterous story about finding their father's papers in a chair, which was completely true, you know, it was up to them whether to let me in or to slam the door in my face. But I think that, you know, because they didn't have this relationship with their father, they took the gamble and they wanted to talk to me. So after I asked them all of my questions, boy, did they have a lot of questions for me. I spent years going around archives all over Europe and the United States, finding stuff about this one low-ranking Nazi. They wanted to know about their father. They wanted to know what he had done.
Well, it's interesting, actually, because does the name Gunter Demnig mean anything to you?
No.
Well, Gunter Demnig is the guy who invented the Stolpersteiner. I happen to know this because, again, coming back to my wife, she's been responsible for laying Stolpersteiner in various locations in commemoration of her family. And just by way of a short explanation, the Stolpersteiner is a German word meaning a stumbling stone. The little bricks which are placed in the pavement outside the houses formerly occupied by Jews who were victims of the Holocaust. And these bricks have a brass top, are highly polished, and they're engraved with the name of the victim and the date on which he or she had to leave his or her home. And these things are placed slightly above the level of the pavement. The idea is you stumble over them. And when you stumble a stone, you stumble over them, you look at it, and you see what it's supposed to be. Now, Gunter Demnig, who is a non-Jewish German artist, invented these because he knew his father had been in the war and he'd fought in the German army. I never discussed it with him. So he didn't know what his father had got up to. And this was his kind of way of, I suppose, atoning for what his father may or may not have done during the war. Anyway.
We see these all over Germany and Austria and other parts of, we don't see them in France. They haven't, this initiative, unfortunately, hasn't started in France, but it's very, very common to see this, you know, in tiny little hamlets where there were only ever sort of, you know, 2 or 3 Jewish families, second, third generation Germans who have taken the initiative to find out about their local history, to find out who were the Jews who lived here. We want to try to remember them. And of course, sometimes it's descendants of Jews themselves who fortunately had survived. It's a wonderful initiative. And
just interesting. Here's somebody who's a second generation who, you know, has got, who's made sort of his acknowledgement in his way. Okay, the book is called The SS Officer's Armchair, quite clearly on the book here, and Griezinger was a member of the SS. One of the interesting things I found, of the many interesting things in this book, is that, you know, we all have our kind of our view about the SS. You know, there are a lot of Nazi murderers, but I was interested to learn from the book there's a lot more, isn't there, about SS and what's expected of them and all this performance about how to join. I just found that very interesting, and I wondered if you could elaborate.
Of course. So Griezinger basically, in a nutshell, look, this is, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to tell everybody about my whole book because there's just not going to be enough time. But in an absolute nutshell, Griezinger joined the SS in 1933. He was in his sort of late 20s at the time. He joined the SS because he was unable to join the Nazi party. He came from his extremely good background, a very upper class Protestant, military, nationalist, extreme right, etc. background. He hadn't been a Nazi when Hitler came to power. That's extremely important. So when we get to 1933, Griezinger, who is a lawyer, he has his PhD in law, he went to one of the best universities. He has a choice to make. Does he sort of go towards Nazism and bet on the Nazi horse, or does he not? The fact that in March 1933, May 1933, the Nazis banned membership was a it was a crucial moment. You could no longer join the Nazi party. We don't want any latecomers coming. Fortunately, Griezinger's training, his background, allowed him entry to the SS. So as you say, the SS is one of these organizations that we think we know so much about. There are hundreds of books on the SS, but from the moment I started doing this research, I realized, my God, we know nothing as historians about the SS. We have just scratched the surface. There is still so much wonderful history that we still need to write about it. And the SS, of course, there were certain parts of the SS where people would be wearing, the men in the SS would be wearing their black leather coats, and they would go around shooting Jews and communists and social democrats. They would be working in concentration camps. They would be working in professional Nazi SS offices in Berlin, of course. But that's not all the SS. Most of the SS, and this is what I write about in my book, were SS members who paid their monthly fees and would go to meetings as and when they chose. It was entirely up to them, okay? There was no obligation for them to wear their SS uniform every day. They were not all in concentration camps, okay? The people like Robert Griezinger he could be as much or as little SS, as much or as little Nazi as he chose. So what we see with somebody like Griezinger is very limited SS activity early on. Yes, he goes to the meetings, he sings his SS songs, he listens to speeches, he might do a little bit of security work from time to time when an important Nazi is visiting Stuttgart, but it is not his bread and butter. And that's really important. And that is one of the main contributions of my book, actually, to sort of unravel what we think the SS was, because we have so many of these images of the SS from TV and film and literature, etc. The SS played an important role in his life nonetheless, because, for example, if you were in the SS, which was, of course, this elite organization that only the most racially pure Germans were allowed entry to, you couldn't just marry anybody you wanted. So somebody like Robert Griezinger, an ordinary guy from Stuttgart, couldn't just marry someone in the local church or registry office. He needed permission from Berlin. He needed permission from Himmler. So when this occurred in autumn 1935, he met this woman. He was actually sleeping with her sister at first, but that's a different story I don't have time to go into. He met her, he fell in love with her, and he wanted to marry her, but he couldn't marry her immediately. She needed to go through all sorts of tests. She needed an SS doctor to measure her hips, to check out her menstrual cycle. Would she be able to produce 4 healthy Aryan children? They had to trace both of their lineage because, of course, you couldn't play a role in Hitler's Germany if you had a grandparent, or you had any ancestry which was Jewish or Slavic or anything non-German. And so another thing which is quite interesting about Griezinger's ancestry, from looking at SS documents in Berlin, is that he actually wasn't as German as I first thought, because this is no discredit to Mrs. Glynn, who is here tonight, but I always learned from school, from what I recall, that Germans, the whole point of Nazi Germany was that Germans were sort of able to sort of, tap into their German heritage. And, we've been around for hundreds of years in Germany, etc. But when we look at Robert Griezinger's ancestry, we see, yes, his mother was born in Germany, but his father was born in New Orleans, Louisiana. And so what we see when we look at his CV, actually, his family tree, is that his family had moved to Louisiana in the 1720s. They'd been in the American South for hundreds of years, well, more than 150 years before part of their branch actually arrived in Germany. And so there were plenty of blanks on Griezinger's CV, on his family tree, sorry. He wasn't able to write the names of various great-grandmothers or great-grandfathers. I had to do that myself when I went to New Orleans and I went to the archives to really find out what on earth his family had been up to in 19th century America.
Okay, you've already alluded to this, but I just want to pursue that a bit further. And the point is made very strongly in the book that the Holocaust and the final solution weren't the preserve, so to speak, of the headline acts, Hitler and Goebbels and Himmler and so on and so forth. And you stress that it couldn't have taken place without the unknown officials, the minor officials, the Robert Griezingers. And I just want to quote a bit of your own book back at you, if I may. And this is you just a couple of sentences. Griezinger gets his dream posting to Prague, and you say, during his time in the Protectorate, it was Griezinger's work at the Ministry of Economics and Labour that proved more decisive than his position in the SS in earning him the status of a Holocaust perpetrator. And I think you've already made that point earlier this evening. When I read that, and I was reminded of the famous statement that Hannah Arendt made in the Eichen trial about the banality of evil. And I just wondered if you could expand on this business of the roles of the minor officials. It's not Goebbels or Himmler's final solution, it's the people behind them. And I just wondered if you could expand on that.
Absolutely. That is precisely what my book is about. I am so interested, and as I've said, turning the gaze away from these people at the top. Because, when we think about what happened in Germany during the 1930s and 40s, and we think about, for example, when we think about how many people were actually tried at Nuremberg, 24 senior Nazis at the end of the war. And then until 1958, I think, there were only 6,000 people put on trial. I mean, how is that possible? Okay, the people at the top could not have done what they did without these tens of thousands of enablers, people who heard the messages, who were drawn to these messages, and who in some way found it attractive. As I said earlier, for someone like Griezinger, he came from a background which was already extremely nationalist, extremely patriotic. We have to, when we look at someone like him, it's so important to stress that he was born in the decade between 1900 and 1910. He was far too young to fight in the First World War. But my goodness, the First World War totally marked his life. The end of the First World War marked his life in a way that, just cannot be explained fully enough. All of these top Nazis, every single one of them, apart from perhaps Hitler, they were all born in this decade, 1900 to 1910. None of them thought that that Germany was going to lose World War I. They had absolutely no sense. Germany was never invaded. So the end of World War I, the end of the First World War, this crushing defeat, the humiliation, the Jews who were responsible for this new Weimar thing, whatever this is, this communist thing. This is something that certain people in Germany on the nationalist right, they were out to destroy. So even though people like Griezinger wasn't a member of any Nazi organization, it took very, very little for him to make this transition, okay? I think I've included a picture somewhere from his mother's diary. I think maybe one of the first few pictures. I was so fortunate that his family sort of, as I said, welcomed me in and were able to sort of allowed me to rummage through their entire house. Oh, I should have just sent the top one. Don't worry, but you can kind of make out here. So what we have in his mother's diary is a woman who wrote every single day about her son, about her relationship with her son. He was a real mummy's boy, and that is very, very clear from the diary. The day he goes to university, he's 18. She sort of breaks down. She writes that she's never going to be able to tuck him into bed at night ever again. It's a real, it was one of the worst days of her life. But my point here is that to get a real sense of this family, I was so lucky to be able to have access to their personal papers, to their personal documents, the kind of things that, you know, most historians can only dream of getting their hands on. So I was really able to get a sense of the family's position on Jews, on communists, and the fear of the other, which is what led them towards Hitler. They weren't necessarily attracted to Hitler or the Nazis. They didn't find, so that's a picture from university days. This one, he was a member of a dueling society. Again, one of these extreme right fraternities, which everyone from an upper middle class aristocratic background would have to join. And it was always very, very important to obtain a schmiss, a scar that sort of runs across your mouth, your jaw, really as a sign of sort of masculine virility, etc. So that you would really sort of on your first day and your first fight, you would sort of go egg on your opponent. You'd be like, come on, get me here. And as soon as the tip would sort of cut into the flesh, you would reach for the salt and rub salt into the wound in order to bring it out, to make the scar out, to make yourself appear more manly. I'm not quite sure why we were talking about, why I was talking about that. But
his attraction to Nazism. In fact, he wasn't sort of, as it were, born a Nazi.
None of them were born. They made this transition. For some of them, it was they were having to compromise a lot. For someone like Robert Griezinger, yes, it was vulgar and disgusting for somebody of his background to see the Nazis in 1933, 34 beating up communists and social democrats and Jews. But did he have much of a problem with it? It wasn't to his liking, but it was just, it was very, he wasn't going to object to that. He needed to get secure a position as a lawyer. He knew that Jews and communists were the enemy anyway. So for him, it was a very, very easy step to make.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that also, one reads in Holocaust literature is that, even the leading Nazis, but we're not talking about those, but even they weren't sort of mentally deranged or psychopaths in any way. They were, in their personal lives, they were just ordinary blokes. And I think you make that point quite strongly when you write about Griezinger and his dog. He had a pet dog, and you tell.
We have a picture. I think there's a picture of the family, and you can actually see the dog. I've forgotten I'd written about the dog.
You tell an anecdote where a dog gets run over. And Griezinger runs into the road, takes off his beautiful linen jacket, and wraps it blood, and ends up with a blood-stained thing wrapped around the dog, which he then takes off to the vet. And you start to think it's a shame that Griezinger and his colleagues didn't behave with the same humanity towards human beings, like Jews, for example. And I just wondered, is this something that appears time and time again? This paradox, this business of, on the one hand, you've got them perpetrating these awful things, or at least allowing these awful things to take place. And on the other hand, he was always kind to his dogs. Griezinger appears to be quite a good family man sometimes.
He's an excellent family man. He really is. He's a wonderful husband, a fantastic father. But I think what we're seeing here is this chilling reminder of how it was ordinary people and not monsters who were responsible for these crimes. He would be going to work in the 1930s. He worked as a lawyer at the Gestapo. He was responsible for some horrific acts. For example, he worked in this building in Stuttgart, in the very center of Stuttgart, called the Hotel Silber, which was the building in which all the Gestapo activity took place. And, like I said, he's a lawyer. He wears his suit to work. He's not wearing uniform or anything like that. He was responsible for sending out the messages for Gestapo thugs to go and round up Jews, communists, social democrats, etc., anyone who was an enemy of the state. And these people would be brought to the Hotel Silber, and they'd be taken down immediately into the basement, into the torture cells there, where they'd be beaten. And Griezinger's upstairs typing away, planning something with his wife and kids or something like that. So there's and even today, I remember in Stuttgart, there are still elderly people in their 80s and 90s who do not walk past the building of the Hotel Silber because of the stories they heard of as children about the atrocities that took place there. It really left its mark on the local community. It was sort of the most awful place you would want to end up in. So yeah, on the one hand, Griezinger is this wonderful family man, and on the other, he is still responsible for carrying out horrific crimes. But there is no contradiction between that, I don't think.
Okay, you don't think so? No. Okay. Griezinger gets his posting. He wants to go to Prague, and eventually he's disappointed once, and then he eventually gets his posting in Prague. And you describe the Holocaust in Czechoslovakia. But actually, what was very interesting is the reprisals that you described that the Czech population carried out against the Germans when the war was over, which I knew nothing about, I don't think. And I just wondered if that was something new for you too.
Well, there were reprisals in France. I mean, as I said earlier, my first book was about Nazi-occupied France. So I was more sort of, I'm more a French historian by training, and there were certainly reprisals that took place in summer 1944, autumn 1944 in France. It wasn't the biggest surprise for me when I saw what was happening in Czechoslovakia. These Czech population had lived under the most horrific occupation for 6 long years. It was awful for the local Czech population. So in May 1945, at the end of the war, and let's not forget, there were still tons of Germans, hundreds and thousands of Germans actually still in Prague. Griezinger was still going to work at the ministry. So even after Hitler had committed suicide at the end of April, there was still this idea. I mean, it's so easy with us, with hindsight, to think about the end of the war as something that was inevitable, that the war was always going to end on the side of the Allies. But so many Germans just did not think like that at the time. So many believed in Hitler. They believed in a secret weapon. There's going to be some magical weapon that's going to appear and we're going to defeat the Allies. And for a lot of them, it was, we just have to destroy the Bolsheviks. We have to destroy communism because they're just going to kill us anyway. So at the end of the war in Prague, there were still many, many Germans there, which meant that in May 1945, when the Russians were almost there, you had this enormous uprising in Prague that took place by the local Czech population, lots of partisans. And at that point, if you looked German, if you sounded German, it was an extremely dangerous place to find yourself. Germans were rounded up in the streets. Many of them were just shot on the side of the road. They were awful, awful punishments meted out to any German women who still found themselves in Prague at that time. Many of them, tens of thousands of Germans, were taken to concentration camps. So of course not extermination camps. They would be taken to sort of empty football stadiums, empty cinemas, and they would just sort of sleep on the floor, sleep on the ground with very small amounts of coffee or food or something. I mean, much more than a Jew in a Nazi concentration camp would have been entitled to, but nevertheless, extremely bad conditions. So that is where Griezinger ended up. Having his wife and children had left Prague. They'd left in March 1945. They tried to make their way to the home of Griezinger's wife's parents, but it was impossible for them to make it there. So his daughters remember saying goodbye to their father. They said goodbye to their father for the last time in March 1945 in Prague. He was supposed to come and join them a few as soon as he could.
Let's put that to one side. Chapter 8 of the book is entitled Stavisha. Obviously, the chapter has a title for a reason. And you track the progress of the Nazi army going through the Ukraine, and in this particular chapter, again, I'm going to quote something back at you. My pursuit of Griezinger prompted me to ask questions about my own family. Just as I had been quizzing Jutta and Barbara about theirs, like them, I'd been avoiding such questions. Other people's families were more interesting and came with fewer strings attached, but now I had a reason to look into my family's past. And I just wondered if you could share those reasons with us.
Yeah, of course. And it's wonderful that you mentioned that, because I think my grandmother's here. I think I can see her name on the side of the screen, because it begins with an A, so she's sort of right up the top there. But so I knew from my grandmother that my relative, that her father, came from this small village in Ukraine, and it didn't really mean much to me. And then sort of I'm tracing I was tracing his entire route throughout the Second World War, and I see that in June 1941 he's part of the invasion of the USSR, this huge operation that was a total secret, even to the Germans themselves. They had absolutely no idea why they were invading Russia. They thought that they'd signed this wonderful pact with Russia, and that, perhaps Stalin is letting us through, and we're going to British India to fight the British, or we're going to Palestine or something. These guys had no idea why they were going to Russia. It was such a big surprise. Anyway, so I'm following Griezinger just as he enters Ukraine in June, July 1941. And what we see when the Germans enter, it's a really important moment for historians, because for so many years after the war, so many historians, let alone just ordinary people, truly believed that when the Germans arrived in the Soviet Union, they were somehow fighting this gentlemanly war against the Russians. So it would be soldier against soldier, etc. But when we actually look at the archives, when we look at what really happened, we see that officers, men who were there as soldiers, were actually conducting horrific acts against the local population. There's actually, I think there's a picture, one of the pictures is of Griezinger in his Wehrmacht, his German army uniform. And so I was really interested in this. I was looking at the letters that were sent home from the front about some of the horrific acts taken place, roundups of Jews, murders of Jews, obviously with bullets or by hanging, within a few days of entering the Soviet Union. Just 2 or 3 days in, they're already murdering Jews in Ukraine. And I suddenly thought, gosh, I wonder, what happened to my lot, so to speak? Because as I said earlier, we think often, you don't need to be a historian to think like this, but when we think about history, we really do tend to think about it in a very vertical way. We think, we know who our grandparents are, we know who our great-grandparents are, and we don't tend to think horizontally. So yes, my grandmother who's here tonight, her father was able to leave Ukraine, but what about his aunts and uncles? What about his, there she is. Hi, Grandma. What about his aunts and uncles? What about his cousins? This is the kind of stuff that was very, very, very tricky to find. And of course, my grandma can tell you better than me that after the war, nobody heard from these people again. All the relatives, their last name was Pugach, nobody ever heard from them. Everybody just presumed that, Grandma, I remember you telling me about, you saw the letters. You said that there were all these letters in Yiddish that used to go to and from London to Ukraine. And you told me that after the war, that was it. You never saw those again.
But you, Daniel, tracked down relatives in America and tracked those letters and had them translated.
Yes,
and
so
you knew what happened to some of the siblings.
Well, exactly. That's because we thought that with the Holocaust, we just presumed, quite for a very good reason, that these people had been executed and murdered. But actually what happened was that a lot of them had been able to survive, of your relatives were able to survive the Holocaust. And it was just a question of families losing touch under communism. And so it was only in the last 3 or 4 years that I was able to find out what actually became of these relatives who were still alive and living in California.
Okay, I've got, you'd be relieved to hear, and so will everybody else. I've just got one more question to ask you. And then if people would like to ask questions or make comments to Daniel, we've got time for a few. Please use the chat facility. You don't have to actually write the whole question out on the chat. But if you just say that you want to join in, then either David or I will call upon you. But lastly, from me. Now, look, this book is meticulously researched, and you've made reference to the research that you've done. And, you know, in the book, you describe from time to time the efforts you went to obtain interviews and meetings. And you also describe, if you'll forgive my expression, how you managed to blag your way into the confidence of any number of archivists. Mind you, not that I would expect any less from a JFS boy, by the way. So it's certainly not a criticism. Had you not been able to do that, that would have been the criticism. But I'm just really intrigued to know, you know, what the challenges, and I don't know where to begin, but the challenges and difficulties of obtaining the material you needed, some of which you've mentioned, but, you know, in order to produce this book, I mean, what is the research process? It's just, you know, it's a foreign country to me. And I was talking to Jane and David over the garden wall a week or so ago. They have a similar mystery to them. So please, how did you do this?
Yeah, it was not easy. You are writing the history of a nobody. It really was. A lot of it, it's funny you mentioned the JFS blagging. I think, yes, I must have learned that at school, how to somehow get archivists to part with papers. I do remember one archivist in particular, I think in Prague, just sort of me begging her to see a document. I went every day, please, please, please. And in the end, she's like, if you promise never to come back, I will show you this document. So yeah, I guess persistence was something we definitely learned at school. But no, in some cases, it was just normal. Well, for me, what's normal? Historical work, going to the archive, just spending hours and hours just going through boxes and hoping to find relevant information. And of course, I was able to do that very easily sometimes because, especially in somewhere like the Czech Republic, where the documents are very well organized. In Germany, the situation was very different. In Germany, so much of the material was destroyed by the Allies. The Nazis themselves destroyed their documents in April 1945. So much of the SS papers went up in smoke. So when it came to finding out information about individuals, when you go to the SS archives, there's only 1/3 of the original dossiers that even remain. So I was extremely fortunate to even find anything. But of course, the more I was sort of hoovering up documents from around Germany, I think what I wanted to find was his voice, more sort of personal, anecdotal family records. And that's when I was meeting dead ends. And so one day I just picked up the phone book to Stuttgart and I just called everybody in the phone book to try and find the family. That's how I was able to meet them in the first place. And just, you know, hello, are you related to Robert Griezinger? And of course they thought I was trying to sell them something and they just put the phone down. But eventually somebody said, oh yes, that was my father's brother. Well, why are you interested? And then I had to come up with some cock and bull story because I didn't want to like just say on the phone, oh, hello, I found his documents in an armchair. So I had to blag my way into a meeting with him, and fortunately it all worked out.
We've had a question on the chat from Jan and Julian. What happened to Griezinger? How did he meet his death? Would you like to examine? I know, but would you like to explain?
Of course. So, I mean, this is something that I don't have a note or anything like that that appeared with the documents inside the armchair. So there's a lot of different schools of thought, and I spend a lot of time in the book talking about his death. So I'm not going to, I won't have time to tell it all here, but in a nutshell, he, as I said, was still in Prague in spring 1945. when I was interviewing his family, a lot of them believed that he was executed in Prague. They knew he was ill. They knew he was in a hospital. When I went, and that he had been murdered in his hospital bed in Prague. When I went to Prague and I looked through official archives, I didn't get that version of events. I got that he had died of dysentery in September 1945 and that his body was thrown on a mass grave. Look, it's really hard as historians to know sometimes whether how far to read into these documents. We know that so many Germans were murdered in their hospital beds in 1945 in Prague, and that on their death certificate, it might say whooping cough or dysentery or something like that. It never says murdered in hospital bed. So all I can say is I do reflect on this more in my book, but he definitely died in a hospital in September 45, and I visited the mass grave where his body lies today in Prague.
The Endelmans are interested in something that you've already kind of alluded to, but the question is, did Griezinger's relatives know you were Jewish? And how did what was their approach to giving you information? Were they reluctant?
I think so when as I said, I met the nephew first. He was the one who eventually led me to meeting Griezinger's daughters. I mean, they're not on speaking terms. There was some massive Broigus in the 1970s. They haven't spoken since. But he was the one who sort of put me in touch with his cousins. And he didn't know at first I was Jewish, I don't think. I mean, of course, when you Google me and you look at my work and what my research is about as a Jewish historian, it does become quite obvious. So I'm not sure. We never discussed it in our meetings per se. But of course, subsequently, now that they've read the book and the book's just come out in German, it has affected our correspondence, not in a negative way, but more, if anything, more of a reflective way, that they're very interested to know more about me, actually, now that this information is out there. But funnily enough, I do think it's funny, when I got my, when I sent the photo, I think for this event, maybe David and Jane, you might have had a photo of me, perhaps, I don't remember, don't show it, but I think I vaguely remember seeing a photo of me on the poster. And it's just, I thought, an ordinary looking picture, nothing to complain about. But anyway, when I sent it to my German publisher, they sort of wrote back to me sort of saying, oh no, we can't use that in Germany for your book cover. And they paid a professional photographer to come to London to take pictures of me for my German book. And look, just speaking to colleagues at the time, they said, you look too Jewish in that picture. Nobody in Germany is going to pick up this book and buy this book.
Okay. Sounds like a line from Jackie Mason, doesn't it? Too Jewish, too Jewish. We've got a number of people asking, two people actually, I mustn't exaggerate, asking a variety of the same question, which is, how did the papers get into the armchair? And what, do you know? Do you want to guess? I mean, did he hide them? What happened?
Well, look, it's again, I reflect on this so much in the book because, like I said, there was no note. There was no sort of goodbye or here's my thing. So there's a lot of me as the historian having to try and put things back together here. But as I've already alluded to, it was so dangerous to be a German in Prague in spring 1945 after the Russians and the Czechs had taken over Prague. You didn't want to pass off as a German. So to even be seen with any of these documents, and let's not forget, these are really important documents. So alongside passports, we're talking his PhD certificate, stocks and shares that were still valid, had never been cashed, still haven't been cashed. Really the kind of extremely important documents that would give you away. So I suppose one possible scenario is that he didn't want to be seen with his documents and sewed them into the armchair. But you know, I know a lot of men with PhDs in law, and I don't know many that can sew particularly well, or even well enough that the items would stay hidden for 70 years. So did he do it himself? Did he know somebody who was able to help him put the documents in here? A lot of the, you know, I speculate in the book about that.
Somebody's wanting to know, did you have difficulty getting the book published? Was it easy to find a publisher?
I think I was very fortunate that I didn't have a problem finding a publisher for this book. I know that sometimes it is extremely hard for some people who want to write about the Second World War to find, as I said at the beginning, people at the moment generally are more interested in COVID, in Trump, in other things. It's hard for publishers sometimes to take a gamble on another book about the Second World War. But for me, I didn't have that problem. I think perhaps being a professional historian helped. Having already published a book on World War II in France would have helped, but I didn't have a problem.
Okay, David, I haven't got more questions on the chat. Can you see any anywhere?
I can't see any hands up.
Okay.
Any hands up? If anybody...
Wait a minute. Yes. Lee wants to know what happened to his son, but he didn't have a son, he had daughters, so I'm not sure.
Correct, but he actually had a stepson. And can you show that picture again, Jane and David? Because interestingly enough, it's such, actually, I don't know if Lee Lewis or who Lewis is, but it's whether you've read my book, but it's a very interesting point you make, because I never actually talk about his stepson because it was his wife's son from a first marriage. You see him here, little Joachim, on the left of this picture. And I tried desperately to meet with Joachim over several years. He lived in Switzerland, and he remembered Robert extremely well because, he, as I said, he was older than his two younger half-sisters. And the interview just never amounted to anything. He just did not return my calls, or we were just never able to speak. And then about 3 or 4 months ago, I had an email from Joachim's son saying, "Oh my goodness, I've just seen that you've written this book about Robert Griezinger and that my father is mentioned in it. I can't believe this. We would love to meet you." And so only about 2 months or maybe 6 weeks ago, I did this amazing Zoom call with Joachim's son and Joachim's grandson, who had interviewed Joachim and was really, really excited that Joachim would meet me. But unfortunately, Joachim died the following week, so we weren't actually ever able to meet. And I really, really regret that, because I do think that he would have known so much more about Robert Griezinger. Some like little details, little nuggets, little family sort of stories that you could, which, you know, in 20 years' time, all of this is lost. Like, it's now or never for recuperating these kind of stories. This really is the last chance to find out personal family details of some of these individuals. Okay, we have any more? Nothing else that I can see on the chat. David, if you can see any yellow hands.
Anybody wants to unmute to ask a question?
Are we all going to the pub afterwards? What happens?
Were his parents, were the children, were they sort of, what's the word, apologetic for what their father had done during the war? Were they, you know, did they realize some of the terrible things that maybe their father had actually done?
It's a great question. And of course, the simple answer is they had no knowledge of their father. They really and truly had, until I came and told them, they had just not ever been able to find out this information from other relatives, or indeed they hadn't gone to an archive and tried to find it out for themselves, which is obviously the case for tens of thousands of people in Germany, not knowing, not asking the questions, living among these silences. And I found with my interviews very, very a willingness to accept and to talk about the deeds of their father. And at no point did they ever try to contradict me. I mean, I can see that Bob has just written in the chat about Philippe Sands. Now, when you think about Philippe Sands and his experience with the son of Otto Werther in his book, you know, Philippe Sands is being met constantly by a son who is saying, excuse me, you are wrong. My father didn't do this. My father wasn't there. You've misread the document, etc. Whereas on the contrary, what I had with Griezinger's daughters was the exact opposite. They wanted to know what their father had committed. And at no point did they ever try to sort of say that their father had, that I was mistaken. They were ready to accept the sins of their father completely.
They never tried to hide it then?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. No. What's very interesting when I think about your question is to reflect more on the third generation, which takes us full circle to what David mentioned when we started, which is we think of second generation, we think of third generation. And what we see in Germany, and it's extremely common, is that whereas the children of Nazis are generally able to talk about their parents as perpetrators, it's much harder for the grandchildren, much, much harder. The grandchildren often want to see the best in their grandparents. And so it's very, very normal for grandchildren to actually resist this idea of grandma or grandpa being a perpetrator. And that, no, they were only following orders, or you have no idea what you're talking about. My grandfather was never a Nazi. That's what we see with the third generation, unlike the second.
Bob, just so you mentioned Bob Colliver was asking about Ratline and Philippe Sands. And I actually have to say that the book has that sort of atmosphere of the Philippe Sands work as well, and also his previous work. Bob is also asking, and you can see on the chat here, also I thought there was education about the Second World War in Germany, but specifically not in Austria. Do you have any comment?
I have absolutely nothing to say about that, Bob. I'm so sorry. That's a very interesting point. I've never read that. I mean, no, my book, since it's been out, there's been stuff in the Austrian press about my book, so I can't comment personally, but I haven't had problems getting my book or what the subject of my book is known in Austria. But that's really interesting, and I'd love to know more about this. Perhaps it's not on the curriculum there. I'd be surprised, but look, anything's possible. And I can see that somebody's just written a question above about, do I want to write about another SS? Absolutely not. Like, no way. As a French historian, I can tell you that when you look at something like the French Revolution, the number of books that have been written about it, and you think, how could I ever write something else? And then you get to the Nazis and you see even more historiography. I am never going to write another book about the SS. Absolutely not.
Yes, it reminds us of Steve, what's his name, the Olympic oarsman, who said if anybody ever got in a boat, he should be shot just before he went and got in a boat and on yet another goal. So we'll tell. I'm sure you mean it as you say it, but you never know. You never know what time might throw up. Do we have any other?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, somebody says
Can
yes.
I ask a question, please? I'm fascinated by your book, but you're obviously fluent in French, but what language did you conduct your interviews in?
I think
French, English, or are you fluent in German as well?
I'm not sure who asked the question, but thank you for the question. Most
From Angela Harris.
Hi, Angela.
Hello.
Most people who grew up in West Germany of that generation, the levels of English is extraordinary. I think Griezinger's kids speak better English than I do. So there was never a problem. I was always, no matter what, even in like some obscure archive in the Czech Republic, I would often take somebody with me just in case something was unfamiliar. So similarly with my interviews, I would always have a native speaker there just in case, but there was never any need, actually. The English was amazing.
So there was never a problem about interpreting correctly what they were saying?
No, and look, they've obviously,
Absolutely crystal clear.
yeah, you're so right to probe me on this. And you know, I've sent them the book long before it had come out, just to make sure that there was nothing lost in translation, and they didn't have a single comment to make on it. I sent it to them a year ago, and you know, we're in regular contact, and I get emails from them very, very often, and they're delighted about the French edition in particular. They spend a lot of time in France. They have an association. One of his daughters, Barbara, her and her husband, they are president, that their little village where they live near Nuremberg is twinned with a little village in France, in the Corrèze. And this village in France has now interviewed me about the story, etc. So they're very happy that the book is out there, and that I'm very lucky that it's getting attention in various languages.
Thank you.
Now the family know that what their father did. Did the children want to change their name, their surname, especially now the book is out, and the name Griezinger is obviously going to be fairly well known?
No, I don't. Number one, they took on their husband's names when they got married, so they haven't had that name for more than 50 years. But I don't think, you know, there's still, when we look around, you know, the Goering, who else do we know? The Himmler children, you know, none of them have changed their names. So I think if the people at the top are still going around with, you know, I open my book with a quote by Martin Bormann's son, who's kept the name Bormann. I don't think I've ever come across Germans who've changed their names. It's a great idea, but for them, I don't think it would have crossed any of their minds to do that. And I would be surprised, but it's a really interesting question.
We have one last question. It's an appropriate question because it ends up where we started. Where's the chair?
The chair is exactly where it was when I first came across it. The chair still in Amsterdam, still in this woman's bedroom, still being used every single day as an item that she sits in. Really, she's had it since 1968. She's not going to part with it anytime soon.
What about the documents?
The documents are back with Jutta, so Griezinger's eldest daughter. And on one time, when I went to her house she lives in a village north of Zurich in Switzerland, she thought she'd lost them. So we'd posted them to her, and you know, I nearly had a heart attack, thinking, oh God, what happens if they get lost in the post? But they eventually made their way to her, and then she went and lost them one day. And so the two of us are up in her attic, just turning things over, trying to find the documents, but we eventually found them, so that they are in her possession.
Okay, well, thank you, Daniel. I mean, I just want to say thank you for giving us your time this evening, but it's more than that, because this has been, I think, one of the most riveting of evenings that I can remember for a long time. And in that connection, I just like to also thank the people at the top of the screen here, Mr. and Mrs. Hantman, for arranging this meeting. It was a very good idea, and really a great evening. And I just want to repeat again what I've already said, that if there is anybody, I think we have 74 people on the call, and as far as I'm aware, 3 of us have read the book. That's excluding you. So let's say 4 people. Let's add in a few more and say, well, there must be 50 or 60 people on this call who haven't read the book. And I really think it's a great read, and it's well worth acquiring a copy. And as I understand what you said already, this is your second book. So I'm now going to have to go to the inconvenience of looking out a copy of Pétain's Jewish Children, your other book, because I tell you, if this is half as good as this one, it's well worth the read. And I must also, before we wind up, I've got to say this, and I'll say this just to you, nobody else can listen. You know, I've got a sort of a feeling of smug pride here, you know, that you're a JFS boy, and what a fantastic example of the type of adult that this brilliant school produces. So many thanks once again. It's been a great book, great evening. Anybody else? That's what we've been talking about, and we shall all.
That's actually the American version.
And we shall watch your future career with great interest, I'm sure. I've also got one of them, which is the draft one, which you said. But thank you, Daniel, again. It's been a great evening. Thank you so much.
And before we go to Bedlam and everybody unmutes, Dave, obviously Daniel, lovely to see you again. So thank you. Love to Lizzie and everybody, the whole family. And I'd like to thank David because you beat opera, mate. You were superb. Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely lovely. Bless you. Bless you. We're very lucky as a community to have you to be able to conduct an evening like that as well. So it's mutual admiration. It's mutual admiration.
Very kind of you to say so. And if you can fix up a meeting when I get the opportunity to talk to you next week, that would be even better.
Everybody can unmute, and it can now be a free for all.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you
very much.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Absolutely.
Thanks for coming.
Get your book.
Where can we get the book from?
Thank you.
Amazon.
Amazon.
It's on Amazon. Okay. What's the title of your other book? I couldn't hear.
I'll put it in the chat for you.
Thank you.
It's
That's the one I'm interested in, because I have French family.
who said that?
Danny.
Hi, Danny. Where's your family from?
Well, my grandmother was French. My grandfather was British, and my grandmother was in Paris, and her sister was the agony aunt of France from 1945. Magazine L, Courrier de Coeur.
So what was your grandmother's last name? What was her maiden name?
Shereshevsky.
Okay.
Because they had their family came from Lithuania and Latvia.
Yeah.
But,
Any of Granny's documents still around, or?
Well, in fact, my French cousin was going to come on tonight, because I actually wrongly thought that the talk was going to be about the Pétain's France. I got that wrong. And so when she found out that you weren't talking about that, she decided not to turn up.
No, I don't blame her. Well, maybe Dave and Jane will have me back to talk about Pétain.
Definitely, yeah.
When my great aunt was 100 years old, the Elle magazine gave her a big write-up.
Oh wow! What had happened to her during the occupation?
She had to flee to the countryside and keep her head down. And then immediately after the war, she was approached to start an agony aunt column. For Elle magazine.
And no diaries or or memoirs lying around in an attic?
In an attic, that I wouldn't know. But she lived in Paris all her life, Paris 17.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for telling me about that. I haven't come across her before.
Marcel Segal, have you come across Marcel Segal?
Now that name does ring a bell.
Well, that's Marcel Shereshevsky.
Ah, okay.
So that was her pseudonym for the magazine Elle.
Yeah, I heard about her, definitely.
Hold on a second.
Yeah, Marcel Segal, yeah. And I also have plenty to. I would like to read Pétain's Jewish Children, actually.
Maybe you should get a copy from your library, because it's really expensive. Pétain's Jewish Children. I wouldn't wish that anyone.
Can you find it on Amazon?
Yeah, but it's really expensive. Don't honestly, just try get it from the library. It's a good read, but it's probably not worth the money.
Whereas this book, David can buy it in bulk.
That's right. Have a discount.
Yeah, the current book is coming out in paperback in a few weeks, and it will be $8.99. Whereas the other book is way too expensive. So I wouldn't.
What is it not in paperback?
Say again?
Is Pétain's book not in paperback?
My new book that I've just spoken about currently.
No, I'm talking about Pétain's Children.
Yeah, it's only hardback with Oxford.
Only hardback, right? Okay.
Yeah, leave it. It's too much. Get it from the library.
And
You can see I'm not a salesman.
what's the next book?
So the next book, I'm working on a couple of things at the moment. I'm working on a diary that I've got about somebody who was in Britain during the Second World War, who was from French North Africa, a Jewish guy who was from Algeria, who fought for the RAF. And I've got his diary, so I'm working on that. And I'm also writing a history of the Jews of Tunisia.
Oh, that's interesting.
Sit in the dark. Yeah. I was going to say, Daniel, what you're doing now, whatever you do, don't change the sails.
Don't change the sails?
The sails, yeah. Don't change the sails.
Stick to history. Don't become a salesman.
Oh, okay.
Dan, thanks so much. That was...
or talk them into doing your first book into paper book.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Go to the public.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting evening.
Yes.
Right.
All right, I'm gonna sign off now, I think.
Yeah, thank you for the talk.
Lovely to see everybody. Really, thank you for having me. It was really, really wonderful.
Brilliant, absolutely fantastic.
Right.
Thank you so
When
much.
thank you. Publishing a book about North African Jewry, is that?
Say again?
Are you going to be publishing a book about North African Jewry?
I will, for sure, for sure. But at the moment, it's not. I haven't written it yet. But
Right.
I definitely will.
In some local congregations, there are some people from Jewish people from Tunisia, so they would be interested probably.
Who's asking me that? Sorry, there's so many names I can't see.
It's Richard Del Monte.
Oh, hello, Richard. Yeah, if you shoot me an email, I can happily, we can discuss that, or you can tell me about some of your ideas.
Okay, thanks very
That'd
much.
be lovely. Thank you.
Daniel, one last question.
Sure.
Where do you live now?
I'm now in Tufnell Park.
In England?